And you're live.
Hi, welcome to Terri Reid's Attic. It's a warm June day here at Terri Reid's Attic, which is one of the reasons why this will be the last Terri Reid's Attic ghost stories. We figured school's out, states are kind of lifting the lockdown, and the attic is a little bit warm. My southern friends say that ladies don't perspire; they glow. There might be a lot of glowing going on during this. So thank you for your patience. David, my son David, was in an accident last weekend. He fractured his skull and he was in ICU. It was kind of a scary situation. Um, but I got to pick him up and bring him home and take care of him for a little bit. Now he's back in his apartment in DeKalb. He lives there, and I check in on him a lot. But he's an adult, so it's one of those. I can't keep him under my wing for as long as I want to, but he's doing fine. So I apologize for missing last week. Yeah, I was just taking care of David. So he's doing much better. Thank you for your thoughts and prayers. So a couple things that were discombobulated because of last week. First of all, my new podcast that came out actually the Friday before Memorial Day weekend had reader stories. Dawn and Linda's reader stories are in the new podcast. So please go check that out. And I am so sorry. I just totally did a brain fry. And so thank you for the stories. And anybody else who wants to share stories, please do so at stories@terrireid.com. Let's see. Do I have any? As I said, this is kind of the last time we're going to read ghost stories for now. We might do something closer to Halloween, if we can do that. This is also, we're going to stop using YouTube. We're finding that the podcasts go to a lot more people and they enjoy it more. So if you've enjoyed listening to stories read out loud like this, go check out my podcast. It's called Terri Reid's Attic, and it should be available at any place where you normally get your podcasts. Send me a message at, I guess, the same place, stories@terrireid.com. If for some reason, whoever you use to get your podcast doesn't have it, and we'll see what we can do about that. Any other comments, Andrew, that I've forgotten?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I think you've got them all.
All right, so let's read the stories. Isn't it? I was thinking about the stories today, and I was thinking, isn't it kind of sad that real life is scarier than ghost stories right now? So let's escape real life for a little bit and just go back with the O'Reillys and enjoy some ghost stories. So last 2 weeks ago, we saw was when Timothy, Mr. O'Reilly, the dad, had that experience at the farmhouse with his car breaking down, with the cruiser breaking down. And then he went back and he saw that the house was abandoned, but he still found the glass of water on the picnic table. Okay, so we'll pick up there. Did they believe you? Mary asked back at the garage. Did they believe you? Aye, well, they had no choice, did they? He replied, because on the trunk of the squad car were the greasy prints of the farmer's hand who'd pushed me down the lane. Whoa, good story, Da, Tom said as he unwrapped a piece of candy and took a bite. But it's not as good as the one I have for tonight. The father studied his son sternly for a moment, and then a smile broke through the facade. Ah, well, we'll see, won't we? He asked with a nod. Tom grinned. We'll see, and then you'll admit it, he replied. He leaned back on the couch, his long legs outstretched before him, the flickering light of the jack-o'-lantern only catching the lower portion of his face, leaving his eyes and forehead in the shadows. Where do I begin? He mused. Well, I suppose at the very beginning. This was all Art's fault. Wait, what? Art exclaimed. What are you talking about? Tom chuckled softly. Well, if you'd piped down, you'd know. It was a bright, sunny summer day in the middle of August, and the calendar in their bedroom reminded them that there were not going to be too many of them left. School was only weeks away, And as 10-year-old boys, they had an obligation to drain every moment of summer out of the time allotted. Art coughed, a thick, raspy cough, and grabbed a new tissue. Tom sighed deeply and clicked on the remote to see what else was on television. You don't have to stay with me, Art told his twin. Really, really, you could go out. Tom turned and looked over his shoulder at his brother, laying on the living room couch with pillows behind him and a cotton blanket over him. Really? He asked. There was silence in the room. They both knew the truth. As twins, they had an unspoken communication. Art didn't want to be left alone in the house, but he felt obliged to offer Tom his freedom. Tom knew that Art didn't mean it, but he really hated missing a nice day. Finally, Art sighed, a rumbly sigh that made him cough again. Yeah, I mean it, he replied reluctantly. No reason we both have to be miserable. Tom didn't wait for Art to rethink his answer. He jumped to his feet and nodded, Okay, I'm going. Where are you going to go? Art asked, wondering if he was just trying to punish himself even more by picturing his brother outside. Tom shrugged. I don't know, he said. Probably the park. I could watch the baseball game. Art coughed again and nodded. Have fun, he said weakly. Tom hurried out of the house, chased by his own guilt. Art would do the same, he reasoned, if things had been reversed, but he still felt like kind of a jerk. He kicked stones and grumbled to himself as he walked the 3 blocks over to the park. Sure enough, there was a baseball game being played, and the scoreboard showed it was the bottom of the 4th inning. Tom climbed up onto one of the bleachers and saw a group of friends from school. As he approached them, one of the girls, Nancy, looked up at him, shielding her eyes against the sun. Hey, which one are you? She asked. Used to the question, Tom shrugged. I'm Tom, he said, finding a seat next to the group. Where's the other one? She continued. You two are never apart. Guilt crept up again. Tom flushed, and then he frowned, not too pleased about being reminded that he had abandoned his brother. He's sick, he snapped. Okay? Wow, don't bite my head off, she quipped back, turning away from him and back to the game. Tom grumbled and sat back against the metal bleacher. Why did everyone assume that he always had to be with Art? They weren't joined at the hip. The guilt continued to fester. Hey, O'Reilly, where's your other half? One of the boys asked when he noticed Tom had joined him. Tom stood up. You know, I can't go out of the house without my brother, he exclaimed. Then he turned around and hurried off the bleachers, jogging across the field and out of the park. He didn't stop jogging until he came to the black wrought iron fence of the old tuberculosis sanitarium. The 158 acres had been mostly converted by the city to a nature park, a senior living facility, and some educational use buildings. But there was still one old building hidden deep in the woods that remained. It was the old mansion house, and it had housed the children's residence, and everyone knew it was haunted. Tom stared at the fence, prohibiting entrance to this part of the acreage. He and Art had argued about checking out the old mansion a number of times. Art had always said it was too dangerous. Art was always the voice of reason, always the fun sucker. Tom looked up and down the street. There was no one around, no one to stop him. He'd show them. He'd show everyone he didn't need his twin to have an adventure. Pulling himself up onto the iron fence, he grabbed hold of a large tree limb that hung overhead. Wrapping his arms around it, he swung his body up and over the fence. He felt the tug, and he knew he'd caught the hem of his shorts on the pointed poles of the fencing. His arms were feeling the strain of holding all of his weight, and he knew if he didn't do something soon, he'd fall. He yanked his leg forward, heard the tear of the material, and then he was free. Scrambling onto the tree limb, He looked down at his shorts. They were torn nearly to his crotch. He sighed. Ma would not be happy about that. Then he looked out onto the acreage, the tree limb giving him an aerial view of the area. He could see the roof of the old building, its tile roof cracked and broken with vegetation growing on the top. He could also see an attic window through the break in the trees. It was dark and empty, but something about it caused a chill to run down his spine. Maybe Art was right. Maybe he shouldn't. Tom shook his head. No, he was going on his own adventure, and when he got home and told Art, he would be a hero. He climbed down the old oak tree and made his way through the thick underbrush to the mansion house. The concrete steps leading up to the porch were cracked and crumbling. Weeds were growing on them, and Tom had to push them aside to get to the stairs. The door had boards nailed over them with signs that read, "No trespassing." His heart thumped in his chest. Should he go in? He immediately heard his brother's voice in his mind telling him that it was against the law and he should turn around. That was the deciding point. He moved closer to the door. Placing his hand on the old doorknob, he was surprised when it turned underneath his grip and that the door was unlocked. He jumped away, not sure what he wanted to do. The door opened slowly, the creak of the old hinges echoing inside the house. Tom swallowed nervously, then moved closer. The boards that had been nailed over the door crossed each other with just enough room for Tom to slip between them. He climbed through and found himself in the open lobby of the house. Most of the windows had been boarded up too, but there were cracks and holes where beams of light shone into the house. He moved forward, dust motes flying all around him. The floor was tile and not fancy as he had expected. Instead, it was gray speckled flooring, like in an old hospital. Inside the house smelled like mold and some medicine, like disinfectant. Tom wrinkled his nose at the smell. It was disgusting. The staircase had a white painted banister that was metal, and the paint was chipping off, leaving large patches of rust. The stairs, made out of the same tile as the floor, were sagging in the middle, and he wondered if they would hold his weight. He walked to the foot of the stairs and looked up. The light from the doorway and the holes in the board didn't reach to the second floor. All he could see was dark. He stared into the darkness, trying to talk himself into going up the stairs so he could tell Art. "It's no big deal," he said aloud, the sound of his voice echoing in the hall. No one's here." The darkness above him changed, black over gray, as a shadow glided across the top of the stairs. His heart in his throat, he stared up, his breath coming in gasps. Was it a cloud crossing over? Was it just his imagination? Then the shadow reappeared, stopped at the top of the stairs, and waited for a few moments. Then it started to descend. A cold chill swept over him, and Tom's heart raced. He needed to get out of the house, and he needed to get out now. He ran across the lobby and pushed himself out between the boards, scratching his exposed leg on a sharp piece of wood. He dropped onto the porch just as the heavy oak door slammed shut behind him. Scrambling back on his hands and knees, he stumbled down the stairs and landed on the overgrown sidewalk. He looked up at the old house before him. and his eyes caught a movement in the attic window. Dressed in a loose white hospital gown, the young girl stared down at him for a long moment and then disappeared. You went there without me? Art complained. You never told me? Tom shrugged, trying to ignore the goosebumps the memory evoked. I really didn't want to talk about it, he explained. I was really freaked out for a while. That was the year you didn't want to go to the haunted trail at the nature park, Sean said. Now I understand why. Tom nodded. I thought for sure I'd see her walking around in her hospital gown, he said with a shudder. So that's how you ripped your shorts and cut your leg, Margaret added. And you told me you'd played baseball and slid into third. Tom nodded and looked a little embarrassed. Yeah, sorry, Ma, he said. I should have told you. She looked at him for a moment and then smiled. Well, when we're frightened, we don't always tell our family about our experiences. Now, do we? Well, that's the start to a story, if I've ever heard one, Timothy said, turning to his wife. What is it that you've never told your family? She smiled at him and shook her head. Well, it's a secret I carried for a long time, she admitted. And tonight's just as good a night as any to let you all know. The grandfather clock was ticking loudly in the front hall, but the rest of the house was silent. She'd pushed a towel against the space between the floor and her door so her parents wouldn't see the light pooling out into the hallway. They'd warned her that taking the extra classes at school, along with her responsibilities at home, would be too much for her to handle. But she'd argued and begged, promising that if it became too much of a burden, she'd let them know. She rolled her head, stretching her neck muscles and working out the stiffness. She'd been stooped over the desk in her bedroom since after dinner, trying to finish a term paper that was due the next day. The clock in the hall had just tolled 1 o'clock, and she knew she'd have to be getting to bed soon if she was going to be able to function at all the next day. She looked down at the neat stack of typed papers on the corner of her desk. She only had the references to type, and then she'd be done. She reached for the glass of milk on the other side of the desk, picked it up, and found, to her disappointment, that it was empty. She debated for a moment. She had about a half hour's worth of work to do. She probably had enough energy without another glass of milk. Then she remembered the spicy gingerbread cake her mother had made that evening, and the decision was made. A piece of cake and a glass of milk would be just what she needed to refresh her body and help her finish her work. Picking up the glass, she flicked off the overhead light in her bedroom, slowly opened the door, and slipped into the dark hallway. They lived in the country, so there were no streetlights shining in from outside to illuminate the house. Only a few well-placed night lights that cast a soft glow in the shadow darkness. She was nearly to the kitchen when she noticed the figure sitting on the couch in the living room. Startled at first, it took her only a moment to realize who it was. Grandpa, she whispered, hurrying to his side. I didn't know you were coming. Do Ma and Da know you're here? He smiled at her and shook his head. Should I wake them? She asked. I know Ma would want to make a bed up for you. He shook his head again. I'm fine, he whispered to her. As the only granddaughter, she had enjoyed a special relationship with her grandfather. They often went hiking or fishing together. He would tell her stories about his youth, and she would tell him of the challenges at school. They would often raid her mother's pantry and remain silent in an unspoken pact when there were questions about missing cookies or pastries, although she was quite sure her ma had figured it out a long time ago. How are you, darling? He asked. I'm good, Grandpa, she replied. I'm finishing up my paper. I only have the references to go. There's me brilliant granddaughter, he said, standing and enfolding her in his arms. She sighed happily. There was nothing like a hug from her grandfather. I love you, darling, he whispered to her, and I've always been so proud of you. She looked up into his familiar eyes and her heart filled. I love you too, Grandpa, she said. He hugged her once more and then stepped back. Now, get your treats and off with you to finish your paper, he said. Make me proud. She nodded. I will. I promise. You always do. She filled her milk cup, cut a piece of gingerbread, and with a quick wave in her grandfather's direction, hurried back to her room to finish the paper. Her alarm woke her bright and early the next morning. She stumbled from bed and headed down the hall to the bathroom. Darlin', could you come to the kitchen for a moment? Her mother called. Nodding sleepily, she changed directions and headed into the kitchen, glancing over towards the couch to see if her grandfather was awake. You won't be going to school today, her mother said as she entered the kitchen. Why not? She asked, clearly confused. Then she noticed that her mother's eyes were red rimmed and filled with tears. Ma, what's wrong? She asked. Your auntie called this morning, her mother explained. Your grandfather passed away last night. Fully awake now, her eyes widened and she shook her head. No, that can't be true, she said. Last night. But before she could finish, her mother interrupted her. It was just before 1 o'clock, she explained, her voice catching. Your auntie was in the room with him. It was a peaceful parting. She glanced over at the couch, then back at her mother, and was about to explain when she thought the better of it. She asked him if he wanted her to wake her parents, and he'd said no. It was his final gift to her, and she would cherish it forever. Margaret wiped the tears away that had slipped onto her cheeks. I never shared this with anyone, she said, until today. Timothy put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. It was a special moment, he said, a sacred moment. Thank you for sharing it. She nodded. He was a great man, she said, looking over at her husband, and I know he would have loved you. He kissed her forehead and hugged her again. Thank you for that, he whispered to her. Then he turned to Mary. It's your turn now. Really? After that story? Mary asked, wiping away her own tears. Well, that's not fair. All's fair in love and ghost stories, Art inserted. Go for it, little sister. Mary sighed. Okay, but my story does not have warm fuzzies like Ma's. Mary O'Reilly watched as the car pulled away from the curb and headed down the street. She felt her heart drop, watching her parents drive away from the sorority house, her new lodging for the school year. She stepped away from the window and looked at the boxes, tubs, and suitcases, all lined up on top of and next to her narrow bed. With a resigned sigh, she rolled up her sleeves and started unpacking all of her belongings. She was in the bathroom, storing her toiletries in her cabinet, when she heard the crash. Fearing the worst, she stuffed her remaining items onto the shelf and rushed back into the bathroom. Confused, she slowly examined the room. Nothing was out of place. Nothing was on the floor. Nothing could have caused that sound. With a shrug, she went back into the bathroom. To her surprise, the items she'd shoved on the shelf were all arranged neatly in order. Did I do that? She asked herself. She finished up in the bathroom, stacked all of her tubs and suitcases together to be put in the house's basement, and finally made her bed. Examining her half of the room with a critical eye, she smiled. It looked organized and homey. She nodded. Yeah, She could be happy there for the next 4 months. Dragging the tubs and suitcases into the hall, she locked her door and then headed across the hall to the staircase to carry the empty containers down 3 flights of stairs to the basement. Piling the containers on top of each other, Mary lifted them in her arms, the containers blocking her vision, and slowly slid her foot forward to feel her way onto the first step down. The slight nudge between her shoulder blades knocked her forward. She gasped in fear as she felt herself falling head first down the stairs. But before she could even emit a scream of terror, strong hands grabbed her shoulders and pulled her back, setting her upright. "Thank you," she stuttered, her heart in her throat. She turned to meet her rescuer and was shocked to see that she was still the only one there. "Hello," she called out, wondering if her rescuer had slipped into one of the nearby rooms. She placed the containers on the floor and walked down the hall. "Hello," she called again. There was no response. "Okay, that was weird," she said, taking a deep breath to calm her nerves. "That was really weird." She started to pick up the containers again when she was interrupted, but this time in a more normal way. "Hey, I can help you with those," a friendly voice sailed up from below her. "You don't want to come down these stairs blindly." Mary put the containers down once again and smiled at the young woman walking up the stairs. "Hi," she said with a quick shrug, and then she nodded towards the pile on the floor next to her. "They're not really heavy, just cumbersome. I can carry them, really." The young woman finished the climb up the stairs and shook her head. "It's not how heavy they are," she said. "It's—" She paused and bit her lower lip, debating her next words. "Okay, don't judge me, but weird stuff happens on this floor. And really, you don't want to go down those stairs and not be able to see." Mary shook her head. "I'm not going to judge you at all," Mary replied, "especially since I nearly took a facer down the stairs just a few moments ago." "Someone push you?" the girl asked. "Yeah," Mary said. "I felt hands on my back, but just as weird, someone caught me and pulled me back up." The girl sighed. "Well, at least you've got someone on your side." "Someone on my side?" Mary asked. "What does that mean?" "Back in the 70s, there was a fire in the house," she explained. "They say it was bad wiring, but no one really knows. Anyway, most of the girls were able to get out, but 3 of the girls got caught in their room. The fire was between them and the staircase, and the fire department didn't have a ladder tall enough to reach the 3rd floor." "Oh, that's terrible," Mary said. "Yeah, it really sucked," the girl said. "But now the girls play pranks on the sorority sisters that live in the house. And—" she paused and looked apologetically at Mary. "They really like to pick on the newbies." "Great," Mary replied. "So one of them tried to push me down the staircase, and another one saved me, right?" The girl nodded and smiled. "And the 3rd one offered to help you carry your stuff down the stairs." And then she disappeared. "Whoa," Sean called out. "I didn't see that coming." Mary grinned. "Yeah, neither did I." "So what did you do?" Art asked. "I mean, with your stuff." "I slowly dragged it down the staircase, one hand on the railing, the other hand pulling the stuff down behind me," she said. "And I didn't have a good night's sleep in that room for the entire semester." "What is it about staircases?" Art asked. "What do you mean?" Margaret countered. Art shrugged, looked around the room at his family. "Well, I guess it's time for my story." The library was quiet, which was precisely the reason Art O'Reilly chose it. Many of his roommates were on sports scholarships, and at this university at least, it meant that they had no fear of the approaching midterms. As long as they performed on the field, they and their scholarships were just fine. So his room and the rooms surrounding it were filled with loud music, parties, and an overall atmosphere not conducive to studying. Art had found a small desk and chair that were nearly hidden in the far corner of the book stacks of the library. The books around him were old law journals and case studies, which were now available online, so he rarely was disturbed by another student. Just behind him was a staircase to a loft area that held reference books, but that staircase was off limits to students. Art felt he had found the perfect hidey hole. His stomach growled, and first looking around carefully to be sure no one was close, Art reached down into his backpack and pulled out a bag containing a submarine sandwich and some chips and placed it on the desk. He knew eating was strictly forbidden in the library, but he had four more chapters to study and didn't have time to go out and eat and then get back to the library before it closed. He took a large bite of the sandwich, drank from his water bottle, and resumed his studies. Lost in a particular case study, Art was surprised when he heard the clicking sounds of the banks of lights being turned off. He glanced at his phone and realized it was 10 past closing time. He wrapped up the remains of his dinner and stuffed it into his backpack, along with his notebook and books, and started to hurry towards the circulation desk. The library was dark, but the large picture windows along the wall allowed the light from the campus streetlights to flow through. Art could see his way through the tall rows of shelves and around the tables towards the front of the library. When he reached the circulation desk, he discovered it was empty. He slowly scanned the library, looking for an employee, but couldn't see anyone. He walked over to a door, but it was locked tight. He started to pull out his phone to call security to let him out, and then had second thoughts. He pictured his dorm room and the party that would certainly be occurring, and realized that being locked in the library could be the best thing that could happen to him. With a resigned shrug, he turned around and walked back to the desk and chair hidden in the back of the library. Looking around the area, he discovered a light switch that turned on shelving lighting, illuminating the titles of the law books. He moved his desk and chair closer to the stacks to take advantage of their minuscule glow. He pulled the remains of his dinner back out of his backpack, took another bite, and then pulled out his book. In a few minutes, he was once again absorbed in the details of a case study. He wasn't sure what made him look up from his book. Maybe it was the sudden drop in temperature in the room. Maybe it was a shadow crossing over the desk. Maybe it was his sixth sense. But whatever the reason, Art lifted his eyes from the book and looked over at the staircase that led to the loft. But this time, the staircase wasn't empty. The woman wore a white blouse and a long skirt. Her hair was pulled up in a bun on the top of her head. She walked slowly up the stairs as if she were carrying a heavy load of books. And Art could see right through her. His heart hammered in his throat as he watched her glide slowly up the steps in an even motion. Then, once at the top of the steps, she stopped and turned. She looked down from her vantage place above him, and her eyes met his. Art felt his blood run cold. He was transfixed to his chair, barely able to breathe and not able to move. The ghosts moved as if to put down the stack of books, then walked to the railing of the loft and met Art's eyes once again. "Shh," she whispered, the sound sending chills up Art's spine. Then she disappeared. Art stared at the spot for several long minutes, too frightened to move. He then quickly stuffed everything into his backpack and, keeping his eyes on the staircase, backed away from his desk and chair. Finally, when he reached the narrow aisles between the stacks, he ran towards the circulation desk and the front door. He knew he'd have to call security. He knew the door was locked, but all he could think about was getting out of the library. When he reached the door, he heard the mechanical click of the door being unlocked, and then he was sure he heard a soft chuckle. He grabbed the handle, pulled the door open, and dashed out of the library into the night air. He didn't slow down until he'd reached the bright lights and noise of his dormitory. "Did you ever see her again?" Mary asked. "Why don't you ask him if he ever entered the library again?" Tom teased. Art grinned. "No to both questions," he admitted. "I don't think I've ever been as frightened in my entire life." "Good story, lad," Timothy said, "and a fine way to end the night." He leaned forward and blew out the candle in the jack-o'-lantern. I know. I kind of stuck a whole lot of stories in there because I wanted to finish the third book in Tales Around the Jack-o'-lantern. So we finished all 3 books in the first 3 books of Tales Around the Jack-o'-lantern. How's my time?
We're only 36 minutes in, so good job.
Oh my goodness. I was really worried because I thought that I was going to be taking like way too much time. And so, do we have questions?
Currently, we have 3 people.
Okay.
Consistently watching us. A 4th person has been popping in and out.
Okay, totally get it. It's summertime.
Summertime and some crazy stuff's happening. So totally
that's
understand.
Very true. Yeah.
Totally understand.
Even Freeport had protesters, which were great. Then we had rioters, which were not so great. So, but that was Sunday night. And last night we had a curfew in Freeport of 8 o'clock and everything was quiet. It was lovely. So let's hope we can soon get back to normal, whatever that is. So,
I mean, we could also hope things get better, I think.
Oh, I like that.
But
even better. Yeah.
Better for everyone.
Yep. Okay.
Terry Snyder said, "I'm glad you finished it for us. I so enjoy your reading."
Thank you. I really have enjoyed doing this. Though I have to say, I have not been as productive like on Tuesdays because I'm getting ready and doing all that. So, yes. So now I'm just going to put the pedal to the metal and finish this book that I've been promising you guys. So, but I'm glad you enjoyed it. I had fun doing this too. And I love the interaction via Andrew. I mean, this has been fun.
Does anyone have any questions?
I'm
not gonna lie, it's like a sauna in here.
It is getting it's yeah, I'm glowing. I'm sure I'm glowing.
I am, yeah.
Yeah.
A gentleman can sweat, and I am doing that. That is for sure.
But I'm just glowing. So yeah.
I'm not sure if anyone has any questions.
Okay. Well, if not, this has been fun. Thank you for letting me come into your computers and your homes and read ghost stories. And maybe we'll do this again. As I said, maybe around Halloween we should do ghost storytelling because this was kind of fun. And in the meantime, please listen to the podcast. They're available through, I think, most podcast providers, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
We're working on Himalaya right now, which is the last podcaster studio so far that people have said we've not been on yet. So we're trying to work on that. So
we should get that in the next couple of days. We'll be on Himalaya, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hopefully. You can find them on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Anywhere that you listen to music, usually you have a place for podcasts.
And we should be on all of those. Mm-hmm. And so
we'll post some of the links up on the Facebook page for
you. The Terri Reid's Attic, right? Okay, good. All right. Well, if you have stories, please share them. I would love to hear them. And again, thank you so much. This has been so much fun. Guys, have a great afternoon and stay cool. Okay, bye for now.